Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabiyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. All right, so looks like we got about 30 minutes or so. So why don't we set the alarm for 7:35, and then that'll give us 10 minutes at least. And then inshallah ta'ala next week, if we can start at, do you want to do 6:30? Okay, so if we could start at 6:30 next week, because the time it keeps going back and back and back, and that after Maghrib, we will, but this is just not a good time for it to be after Maghrib. We need Maghrib to come back a little bit more to us, and then we ultimately will be between Maghrib and Isha. So if you guys can bear with us for maybe another month at 6:30, and then after that we'll go between Maghrib and Isha. Just so I know that as it gets earlier, it's hard to get here because of work. But we'll just, if we can just do the best we can for the next few weeks, and then Maghrib will be early enough for us to do it between Maghrib and Isha, inshallah ta'ala. So today we'll look at chapter number 19 without trying to rush too much. And this is a very important chapter, and it's actually the first chapter in a section of 3 chapters in which the Imam, rahimahullah ta'ala, he will begin talking about wasa'il ash-shirk. He'll start talking about the agents of idolatry and the root causes of it. And this is important after he talked about examples of a shirk, and then he talked about the main justifications that the idolaters give for their idolatry. Now he comes to an important chapter, which is the root causes, because if we know the root causes of something, if we know the things that they are not themselves shirk, but if you do them, it sets you on a path, it sets you on a collision course with a shirk. Then if you avoid those things, then you ultimately avoid a shirk. And so now the Imam is going to give us 3 chapters where he talks about historically some of the main root causes or the main agents that cause people to commit idolatry and to ultimately leave Islam. And so he gives us this chapter where he says, Babu ma ja'a anna sababa kufri bani Adam wa tarkihim dinahum huwa al-ghuluw fi as-salihin. Which means the primary cause of man's infidelity, the primary reason why man disbelieved after having believed, lost faith after having faith, and abandoned his religion, is excessive exaltation of righteous individuals. That man went overboard in what? In exalting individuals. And the bigger and bigger and bigger he made people, ultimately they got to a point where the human ceiling was what? Was basically broken through. That glass ceiling of humanness was broken through, and there was nothing left except to what? To make them joined with what? With the divine. To make them equal with Allah, and to make them rivals with Allah, and to worship them. So basically, this is the first wasila. This is the first means, or the first agents, or the first of the root causes that caused people over time, historically, to commit acts of idolatry. And he, in this chapter, and this is, first of all, before I say that, it's very important for us to understand that in our religion, we are taught, we are programmed, not just to avoid evil, but to avoid everything that can lead to evil. And you find this repeated in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just doesn't tell us to avoid sin, but to avoid everything that leads to sin. So for example, he says, Tilka hududullahi fala taqrabuha. These are the limits, the boundaries of Allah, so don't come close to them. Not just don't do them, but don't even come what? Close to them. You also have the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. He says, and don't come near to fornication and adultery. Not just don't do it, but don't even come near to it. And you have the hadith of Nu'man ibn Bashir where the Prophet said that he said, al-halalu bayyin wal-haramu bayyin wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat la ya'lamuhunna kathirun min an-nas فمن اتقى الشبهات استبرأ لدينه وعرضه ومن وقع في الشبهات وقع في الحرام. And إلى آخر الحديث. So in this hadith, a very famous hadith, An-Nu'man bin Bashir, he said, the Prophet said, lawful is clear, unlawful is clear, and between them are some what? Some gray areas, right? And most people don't know the ruling, or many people don't know the ruling of those gray areas. So the people who what? They stay away from those gray areas. They avoid them. Then they will safeguard their reputation and their religion. And the people who go ahead and say, well, it's not haram, and they go ahead and get into those gray areas, ultimately they'll end up what? In haram. Because what are those gray areas? They're ultimately stepping stones to what? To the haram. You guys see that? طيب. So in this chapter, the Imam, what he's going to do is he's going to cite 2 verses, plus the commentary on the second of the 2 verses. And then he's going to cite 3 ahadith to basically make the point to make the point that man, the primary reason why he left his religion, the religion of at-Tawheed, and became a disbeliever, the primary reason was because of this tendency, this propensity, this tendency that man has to do what? To go overboard in exalting and admiring and commending the righteous people. So, you think it would be okay if we turn the air conditioner on or the fans or something? Because it is a little hot in here. All right. طيب. So he starts out with the ayah from Surah An-Nisa, which is the 4th chapter of the Quran, verse number 171. And that's the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in which he says, Ya ahl al-kitabi, لا تغلوا في دينكم ولا تقولوا على الله إلا الحق إنما المسيح ابن مريم رسول الله وكلمته ألقاها إلى مريم وروح منه فآمنوا بالله ورسله ولا تقولوا ثلاثة انتهوا هو خير لكم right هو خير لكم right لا انتهوا خير لكم طيب. So he says, O people of the scripture, do not commit excess in your religion or say about Allah other than the truth. The Messiah, now notice the example he gives of what? Of exceeding the bounds and committing al-ghulu. He gives the example of the Christians and their ghulu, their excessiveness and going to extremes and exceeding the bounds in praising Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus son of Mary. So he says, the Messiah, Jesus son of Mary, was but a messenger of Allah and word which he cast into the womb of Mary, and a soul created by him. So believe in Allah and his messengers and do not say 3, desist, it is better for you. So the word used in the ayah is al-ghulu, which means mujawazat al-had, madhan aw dhamman. It's when you exceed the bounds, acceptable limits, in excessive commendation on the one hand, or excessive condemnation on the other hand. So al-ghulu, you could do al-ghulu, you could exceed the bounds in a positive way, but you go beyond what is allowed on the positive side. Or you could exceed the bounds in a negative way and go beyond what is acceptable on the negative side. So for example, if a person was praising someone and said, oh, this guy, he's just the greatest. He's just perfect. He's impeccable. There's no fault in him, right? So this is what? You're commending him, but you're exceeding what? The bounds in commending him, because is there anyone perfect? Is there anyone impeccable? Is there one who is faultless? Okay. Like a person on the other hand could say, oh, this guy, he's the most deceitful person in the world. He's the most evil person in the world. He is the devil himself. Okay, so now he's going to extremes, but now on the other side in condemnation. Because is there any person who has no good in them whatsoever, and they never tell the truth, and there's no one like that. There's some bad people, but in many cases what people do is what? They go to the extreme in condemning people. So either way, it's al-ghulu. But in this verse, obviously Allah is talking about al-ghulu on the other side, that you're commending someone to the point where you exceed the bounds in commending them. And so in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is highlighting the excessive praise of the righteous people, and he provides this example of this excessive praise that led to what? Idolatry, that they ultimately praised Isa until he broke through that glass ceiling of humanity and became, in their eyes, became a god. And they didn't just make shirk in terms of the names, because the names of Allah that are only his, they started calling him by those names. For example, Ar-Rabb, right? and Malik al-Muluk, right? The King of Kings, and the Lord. These are names that they call him, right? They refer to him. So these are names of Allah that are exclusively his. So they committed shirk in that sense. They also committed shirk in terms of what? Certain attributes that are belong only to Allah, they gave them to Isa. And also, obviously, they committed shirk in terms of what? And worshiping him and calling him the deity. طيب. So this is one example to support the chapter of the title of the chapter, that what causes people in many cases to fall into idolatry, to leave Islam, is what? Going overboard in praising and lauding and exalting the righteous people. Then after that, he follows that with another verse, and that verse is from Surah Nuh, the 71st chapter, verse number 23, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَالُوا لا تذرن آلهتكم ولا تذرن ودا ولا سواعا ولا يغوث ويعوق ونصرا. They said, leave not your deities, leave not Wad, nor Suwa', nor Yaghuth, nor Ya'uq, nor Nasr. Nasr. So now, if you look at this verse is talking about the people of Nuh, who they had these, as we're going to see, they had these men that they adored, and when they died, they erected statues in their honor. And then ultimately they became deities that they worshiped besides Allah. And when they did that, and they were told when Nuh came and said, hey, you can't be doing this, they said what? Remain firm in worshiping these idols. Okay, so the link between this verse and the chapter itself is, as we're going to see, not only did they laud and exalt these men, these human beings, until they made them deities. Not only did they do that, but that act of idolatry was the very first act of idolatry committed in what? In the alam, in the world. And what caused it? So prior to Nuh, the people, there were 10 generations from Adam to Nuh, and nobody committed shirk. They did other crimes. Like murder, right? There were other crimes. But no one committed the crime of a shirk. The people were upon Tawheed for 10 centuries. And then, during the time of Noah, that's when the people committed the first act of shirk. Where did it come from? It came from statues. Where did the statues come from? It came from the desire to exalt, to admire, to laud, and to elevate the status of certain human beings beyond what they're entitled to. So we get the explanation of that from Ibn Abbas, in which he said, these are the names, Waddan wa Suwa'an wa Yaghuth wa Ya'uq wa Nasra. These are the names of some righteous men from Noah's people. When they passed away suddenly and altogether, at the same time, Satan inspired their people to erect statues in their honor and place them in the places where they used to gather and to name them with their names. They did as instructed, but they didn't worship them. But later, when those people who knew the initial purpose and intent of the statues died and knowledge was forgotten, subsequent generations worshiped them. So what happened? Initially, what did the people do?
They just built it to remember them.
That's it. That's all they did. Right? All they did was what? Exactly. They built these statues to what? To honor them, built them in their honor, and to what? To remind themselves, to recognize the virtues of these men, and to remind themselves of their virtues. So they would do what? They would do virtuous things too. Every time they saw them, they say, oh, remember so-and-so, he used to feed the poor. So-and-so used to give water to the thirsty people. So-and-so used to house the homeless. And so they would be reminded of them, these good deeds, by these statues, and then they would do similar deeds, right? That was their intention. Okay, so now the act that they did when they built the statues with this intention, and as we're going to find out, first of all, let's read the quote from Ibn Qayyim. He says, a large number of the preceding scholars said when they died, people stood for extended periods at their graves. Then they made those statues, and after some time had passed, these practices evolved until they worshipped those statues. So they built the statues, and then when they built the statues, what would they also do? Stand at their graves. Now they would stand at their graves to remember them for the sake of Allah. These acts, are they shirk? No. They built statues, that's wrong. All right? And if they did it for the sake of Allah, so they would remember these men, they did it as an act of worship or a means to get close to Allah, it would be bid'ah. It'd be an innovation. You do something which has no basis, but you do it with the intention to draw close to Allah, makes it bid'ah. Then they stood at their graves, solemnly, reflecting, as a means to get close to Allah. That's also what? No, bid'ah, right? Bid'ah, because they were doing it for the sake of Allah, to get close to Allah, by what? Standing at the place of these people they consider to be righteous and holy. But ultimately, this bid'ah led them to do what? To commit a shirk, right? And as we're going to see, hopefully if the time permits, that the scholars derive from this hadith and other nusus that al-bid'ah barid al-kufr. That al-bid'ah is what? It's the precursor. It's the thing that leads ultimately to what? Disbelief. And this is why it's important for us to be what? To be bid'ah phobes, right? You know how they have germaphobes? You have bid'ah phobes. Yet, no, I'm afraid it might be bid'ah. We should be like that. Why? Because it can lead to us to being what? To ultimately commit al-kufr. طيب. So these two quotes make it clear, right? The connection, you can see the connection clearly. That the very first act of shirk, a direct line can be drawn between it and what? And al-ghulu bis-salihin, going overboard and admiring the righteous people. Okay, so you can see the clear line being drawn. In fact, the first act of shirk was committed as a consequence of what? Of this. طيب, then after that, you have the hadith of Umar, in which the Prophet said, لا تطروني كما أتت النصارى ابن مريم إنما أنا عبد فقولوا عبد الله ورسوله. So he says, do not go overboard in praising me, using the word itra, as the Christians went overboard in praising Jesus, meaning that they took this very righteous person and they elevated him until the glass ceiling of humanity was broken and there was nothing left except what? To make him a deity along with Allah. Right? So don't do that, because if you do that, if you start overpraising me, you'll probably wind up where they wound up, committing what? A shirk. Okay, so that's a clear indication that the Prophet ﷺ is prohibiting this because of what it could ultimately lead to of idolatry and disbelief. Then you have that hadith of Ibn Abbas in which he said that the Prophet said, إِيَّاكَ وَالْغُلُوفَ فَإِنَّمَا أَهْلَكَ الَّذِينَ مَنْ كَانَ فَإِنَّمَا أَهْلَكَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ الْغُلُوفَ. Be aware of exaggerating, excessiveness, because those who preceded you perished, they were ruined, their religion was ruined, and they were ruined spiritually because of their exaggeration. And this hadith is very similar in meaning to what? To the hadith of Umar. That basically I'm prohibiting you from this because of what it can ultimately lead to of what? Of a shirk, idolatry, and disbelief. And then last but not least, you have the hadith of Mas'ud in which he said that the Prophet said, هَلَكَ الْمُتَنَطِّعُونَ, and he said it 3 times. Destroyed are those who go to excess, those who go to extremes. Destroyed are those who go to extremes. And again, it's the Prophet basically saying, this is the consequence of this behavior. So avoid this behavior. Just avoid it altogether. And again, that goes back to what we said before, that our religion doesn't just prohibit the evil, but it prohibits everything that leads to what? To the evil. طيب, so let's look at some of the fawaid ala ujala, and then we'll hopefully have some time for a discussion. So one of the things that you see, the common theme, is that Islam prohibits excessiveness generally, going to extremes. And it prohibits excessiveness particularly when it comes to righteous people, people that we admire, people that we look up to, people we respect, that we have to basically draw a line that we won't cross in terms of what praising them. And what we won't do, because the Prophet used the word, al-itra. Al-itra is similar to al-ghulu, but it only has the meaning of al-madh, commending. It doesn't have the other meaning. Remember, al-ghulu, you could praise and go too far, and you could criticize and go too far. Al-itra is only madh. You only use it to commend, right? But the thing about al-itra, which is additional to al-ghulu, is it yazidu fi or yuzadu fihi al-kadhibu fi dhalik. That basically when a person commits al-itra, not only is he commending, but he's commending and saying things which are totally what? Dishonest. There's no truth in it whatsoever, right? This person is Superman. Right? This person can fly. There's no truth in it. But because he's so enamored by the person that he feels like truthful praise isn't enough. So he has to what? He has to be dishonest. Okay? So you can see that the Prophet ﷺ is saying excessiveness is wrong in general. Particularly the excessiveness as it relates to what? Individuals. That makes you go to the point where there's this glass ceiling of humanity, and you what? You break through it. This person deserves to be more than human. When you do that, what's left for you to do except to make them a deity? And when you do that, you leave the deen. You guys see that? And so this is the message of the chapter. And then there's a few fawaid. I'll try to mention them ala ujala so that we can have a little time for discussion. So one of them that the Imam mentioned in his Masail, he said that one of the things you see from the chapter is he says, Ghurbat al-Islam, the peculiarity of true Islam. And he says that why? Because most people are excessive in their admiration and praise of the apparently righteous people. So basically, it's very common for people to go overboard in praising and admiring people, especially those who they consider to be what? Righteous or holy. So for example, we have a problem right now in our ummah, in our community, where there are certain scholars who are considered infallible. And whenever they say something, they don't even have to have evidence. That people have to accept what they say on face value. And if people don't accept what they say, immediately those people are considered, they're put into what? A negative category. The negative category could be, you could be called a disbeliever. You could be called a mubtadi'. You could be called dal. You could be called an innovator. You could be called someone who's astray and misguided. If you just don't accept what this person says at face value. Then you have also another problem that we have in our community, especially here in the West, is that you have certain people who have donned the cloak of scholarship and have put themselves in position to be regarded as people of scholarship, people of knowledge. And they are not worthy of that. But they somehow, some way work their way to celebrity status. And then they begin to say things which are completely erroneous. We're not talking about fiqh opinions where you have two opinions which are equally substantiated. And so you could go either way on it. No, we're talking about opinions which are either shadh, min ash-shudud, they're totally what? Unorthodox, and very few people uphold those opinions, or opinions which are what? Totally unfounded and not considered to be valid opinions. And they take those opinions and they begin to propagate those opinions in sittings and in gatherings of people who don't have the level of knowledge and understanding to be able to kind of parse through what they're saying and distinguish the truth from the falsehood. And people begin to what? To adopt these opinions, because what these people are trying to do, as some of the scholars have said, khalif tu'raf. If you differ from people, if you take the odd opinion, you'll what? You'll stick out and you'll get notoriety. And some of these people do want that. They don't have the best of intentions. So what starts to happen is people start to, get this big following. And then someone will say, hey, this person is saying something. You khalif al-ijma'. This person is saying something that goes against the agreement of all the scholars throughout history. This person is saying something which is unfounded, something which is baseless, something which is unprecedented. And people will defend them, vigorously, and begin to say that the people who are saying something about this person are what? They're jealous or this, that, and the third. So we have this problem of people, just elevating people beyond the status they deserve. And this is not something which is just a Muslim thing. Even the non-Muslims have this problem. And we've seen it within the last a few years with the individual who used to be in the White House. That basically, I don't remember a time when a person who was not running for office, people would put signs with their name in front of their house. When that person was not just no longer running for office, right? They're no longer running for office. They're no longer in office. And they haven't been in office for like 2 years. And people will still have their sign out. People will have like a big pane glass window. And instead of having a curtain, they'll have a flag the size of the pane glass window that says what? Trump, right? You have people who have, flags, right? You know how people put the American flag out in front of their house, a big old flagpole. They don't have the American flag. They have a flag that says Trump. They have a flag that says Trump. There was a CPAC conference, I think a year or two ago, and they were selling statues of him, and people were buying them. So again, this is a problem, as the Imam said. He said, "Ghurbat al-Islam." What you see from this chapter is the peculiarity of true Islam, because most people, Islam is calling us to what? Not just to Tawheed, but not to be excessive when it comes to what? Human beings, right? Really to put people in their proper place, not to give them more than they deserve, not to give them less than they deserve. But what most people do, and we've seen examples of it, is they do what? They go to extremes and give people more than what they're entitled to. Tayyib, another benefit that comes from the chapter is that falsehood is seldom accepted unless it is mixed with truth. Falsehood is seldom accepted unless it's mixed with truth. And you see that in the actions of the people of Nuh. There was truth in what they wanted to do or what they were doing. And that truth is what mahabbat as-Salihin, loving the righteous people. Loving the righteous people is something good. It's from the deen. It's something true. But the falsehood was believing that the way to demonstrate that love was to do what? To erect statues, to sit solemnly at their graves, and ultimately to worship those statues. And so this is very, very important for us to, it's very, very important for us to pay attention to in life nowadays, when there's just so much confusion about right and wrong and truth and falsehood, and so many different fatwa, and so many people saying different things, and so many people with so many different, tawajjuh, etc., perspectives, is that we have to be careful when we adopt opinions, and be careful that the conclusion that we've come to isn't a mixture of what? Truth and falsehood. So for example, I'm going to close with this to give you guys an opportunity. So for example, you'll have people say a man has to take care of his family. A man has to do what he has to do to take care of his family. And there's truth in that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, "Ar-rijalu qawwamun al-nisa." Men are the protectors and maintainers of women. It's our job to go out and, earn a living. You know what I mean? To do what we have to do to bring home the halal turkey bacon, right? Okay? We have to do that. And we also have the hadith where the Prophet said it's better for you to go out with some rope, go to the hills, cut down some trees, cut those trees into firewood, wrap it up, bring it back on your back, a bundle of firewood, and try to sell it in the market. How much are you going to get for some firewood? Yeah, you won't get much, right? He said that's better for you than to what? To extend your hand to people, asking them whether they give you or whether they don't give you. So it's important for us to do that. So that's truth, haqq. But then a person says, so a man can do any profession. Whatever he has to do to take care of his family. He can open up a liquor store, right? He can go open up a liquor store. He can go open up a gas station, sell beer, wine, lotto. He can do if he's doing to take care of his family, it's okay to do that. What just happened? How did he get there? He mixed what? He mixed truth with falsehood. And so we have to be very, very careful, because many of us, we're inshallah ta'ala, we're sincere. But what happens is that when you really want something, you feel desperate for something, that religious sincerity, what happens is we don't want to say, like some people say, I don't care what the deen says. I'm going to do what I want to do. No, we do care. But we don't feel that what we want is attainable if we comply with the religious ruling. So what do? We start to do what? We start to take the truth and do what? Mix it with falsehood and come up with something that allows us to do what we want to do. So we have to be very, very careful. You see that? Because this is what happened to them. There's more to say, and maybe we'll just pick it up where we left off, because there's a lot of fawaid that we don't want to go unsaid. But we have about 5 minutes or so before the adhan, and we'd like to give you guys a chance to ask any questions or make any comments or critiques that you might have. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabi Muhammad. You asked last week about a dua li ghayr al-Muslim or al-Kafir, making dua for a non-Muslim. So obviously, a dua lil-hidayah, asking for their guidance, is something which is permitted across the board. But it appears that asking also for worldly things, like for example, for their health, for prosperity, for children, it's also permissible to ask for those things. And for example, among the scholars who mentioned this was Ibn Hajar al-Haytami. He mentioned it. Also, Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala has a fatwa to this effect. And also Al-Lajna Da'ima, the permanent committee in Saudi Arabia, they also have a fatwa to this effect. And there's a number of evidences that have been mentioned to support it. So for example, I think it was Ibn Abi Shaybah in Al-Musannaf. He has a hadith that he mentioned in which the Prophet ﷺ made dua for a Yahudi. And he said in that dua, he said, أَكْثَرَ اللَّهُ مَالَكَ وَوَلَدَكَ وصح جسمك وطال عمرك. Right? So he said, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase or make abundant your wealth, make abundant your children. May He give you good health, give your body good health, and may He give you a long life. And there's a similar dua that was made, collected by Al-Bukhari in Al-Adab, Al-Adab al-Mufrad, in which I think it was Uqbat ibn Amr, he made a similar dua for a Nasrani. And so it appears that you can do it because the evidence points to that direction, and scholars have made fatwa to that effect. Barakallahu feek, Shaykh. All right, طيب. Any other questions, comments, critiques?
About the shirk.
Hey.
So you mentioned that the biggest problem in Yemen is you mentioned shirk. But like especially in the Middle East, the major like two groups is the Sufi and Rafid. Rafid, especially right now,
Subhanallah.
their shirk is like become more and more. Like 2 days ago, now you know like this is the time of Muharram and Sufar and
Yeah. Subhanallah, yeah.
Wallah, one of the Kubara 2 days ago, he think that one of the Ma'sumin, so-called Ma'sumin, a Muslim came to him, asking him that his parents passed away, and he missed them.
Hey.
And that one of the Ma'sumin, he said, go home and you will find them. I brought them back to the life.
Subhanallah.
He go to the house and he found them live, and they lived for a long time.
Really?
Yes.
Allah al-Musta'an.
People they believe.
Hey.
And this is karama.
Hey.
And we think that those people can
Hey.
bring the to the life. And Ali he's the writer. He's the person who's like moving the earth and the sun.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
Yeah, so that comes from the ghulu.
Yeah, there's no question that's an example of al-ghulu.
Before 2003.
Hey.
Yeah, and they were so like, no, we are just like asking Allah that bijah, nitqarab bijah.
Hey.
And then after 2003,
Now it's a totally different thing.
Changed.
Totally different thing.
Changed.
And there's no question that, as we said, al-bid'a barid al-kufr. That it starts, as Ibn Taymiyyah said, تبدأ صغيرة ثم تكبر حتى تكون كبيرة. That when innovation happens, it always starts what? As something small, and people will they'll say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Why you make it such a big deal? We make a big deal. Why? Because it never stays small. It's like certain types of foliage that once it gets into your like your grass, it's like you got to get this out because it's going to take over. And it's like that. That's how it is. Subhanallah. Yeah. Eh. Eh. Subhanallah. أهواءهم. Allah المستعان ولا تكلم. Allah al-Musta'an. I mean, may Allah protect us all, man. I mean, this is a big problem in the ummah, and it's not just. We have to be careful too, because we don't want to make it seem like we don't have this issue. Ahl Sunnah, we do it too. We maybe not to this extreme, but we do go to these extremes and we elevate people. We elevate. I mean, like Ahl Sunnah, like a Salafiyin. It's like we make certain people ma'sumin, and they can't be wrong. They can't make mistakes. You can't even question their fatwa. ايه
قد تصل حد الى التعصب
ايه
التعصب الاعمى قد يحذر من العلماء المعاصرين.
Yeah, and so we have to be very careful because it starts like that. We can say, oh, we're not as bad as Rawafid, we're not as bad as at-Tasawwuf, but it can get there if we don't really stick to truth. And we're the people, like as-Saafiy said, he said أجمل العلماء أو أجمل المؤمنون على أن من استبانت له سنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يكن له ليدعها لقول أحد كائنا من كان. We have to have this. As-Saafiy used to say, the believers are in agreement that once the sunnah becomes clear to anyone, they have to follow it, and they're not allowed to leave the sunnah for the statement of anyone, no matter who it is. No matter who it is, we have to. If we follow that, and if we believe that, and if we practice that, then we'll be successful. But if we say, okay, we're not going to practice it completely, but we won't go as far as al-Rawafid or al-Rafida. طيب, the people of Nuh, they didn't set out to commit a shirk, but ultimately they did. Same thing, we're not going to set out to what? To worship these ulama. Yeah, but once we set foot on that path, it's what? It's a gradual process that'll ultimately get us there. So we shouldn't set foot on the path at all. And with that, we'll bring today's session to a close. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Again, يا إخوان وأخوات, next week 6:30. 6:30, inshallah, 6:30.